Hi, my name's Ashley Brene. Welcome to the Akron Central High School History Club. What might your name be?
My name is Lois Brockway.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Ashley.
We'd like to thank you for coming to this interview. Here is some water if you would like a drink.
Thank you.
I have many of questions for you to ask you. First one is, what is your occupation?
Well, I am a town historian, a town of Pembroke historian. And before that, I worked at the Genesee County History Department, but I'm retired from there.
Wow. Wow, that's really interesting. From what I hear, Murder Creek extends from some other towns. Is that right?
Yes. It starts, I believe, in the town of Darien, goes through Pembroke, and through a portion of Akron till it meets the Tonawanda Creek.
Could you tell me some more about how long is Murder Creek?
I really don't know how long it is.
Okay. In your opinion, what is the true legend of Murder Creek?
Well, probably the true legend is the one that was told by Dr. Arthur Parker and his account of it in the Buffalo Historical Society booklet. There probably are many other versions that have been changed and altered as they've been told through the years, but I think that is the true one.
That's cool. I believe that too. Since your occupation is an historian, what event do you wish you were present for in our history?
Oh golly, that's a hard one. There's so many things. I'm real interested in the Civil War. I just can't imagine what it must have been like when these units were formed and all these young men and older men that were basically all farmers mostly just left the area and left all that work for the women to do. It would have been interesting, I think, to see that. Although I don't think I would have liked to have been a woman then, having to do all that work.
I understand you meant Buffalo Bob. Who is he?
Buffalo Bob was the operator of Howdy Doody. There was Howdy Doody and Buffalo Bob, and I'm sure it was way before your time.
Oh, yes.
I first met him when I was only about 5 years old. He lived around the corner in Buffalo from my aunt. But then after he became famous and with Howdy Doody, I met him again and had a nice visit with him and renewed some old times on Northampton Street in Buffalo.
What was Buffalo Bob like?
Oh, very friendly, very, very nice, very outgoing, very musical.
Really? What kind of musicals did he do?
He played the piano, and you could not stump him on a tune. You could mention any tune and he could play it.
What are some of your childhood memories when you came to Akron?
Oh, goodness. Oh, there's a lot of them. Because basically I lived in Indian Falls, which is 5 miles away, and basically that's where we went. We came to Akron to the Park Theater, where I think it cost a dime to go to the show. And it was always a lot of fun to sit in the balcony. And after the show, it was really very neat because you didn't have to go outside when you were leaving the show. You could go right into the Oasis and get one of their delicious chocolate sundaes.
Was it really good?
It was really good. Well, it was really good because you didn't have ice cream in your freezers then when I grew up, because you didn't have freezers. You only got ice cream when you went out to get it, so it was really a treat. And then we would come over to get groceries and also come to the Russell Park. That was always a big thing on Saturday nights, I believe, when the band played and they had the bandstand there. and you would come on Saturday night and listen to the bandstand. And of course on 4th of July, it was always a place that we came from out of town.
Who did you come to Akron with when you come to
And
Akron?
I came to anybody I could get a ride with. Not too many people had cars back then, so when anybody was coming to Akron, if you knew it, you would always, hey, can I go along?
Do you have anything else to say about Murder Creek? Like, what was, I think, Murder Creek?
Oh, the legend of Murder Creek?
Yeah.
Well, they tell me that it was taught in schools
Really?
back around the early part of the 1900s. It was a part of their school textbooks. And mostly how Murder Creek got its name, and that was because a early settler in Darien was murdered, him and his family. And supposedly that is how it got the name Murder Creek. And that, at least that's what was taught in the school.
I see you brought a legend of Murder Creek. Could you tell something about it? Like,
Well, as part of my job as town historian, I try to print different brochures on the different histories of the town. And one of the publications that I did was on the legend of Murder Creek. And basically it is copied from Dr. Arthur Parker's rendition of it. And it's pretty interesting. Back then, the Indian maiden that played a part in the legend of Murder Creek supposedly lived about a mile from where I live in Indian Falls in a place called Spirit Lake.
oh,
And it's got a lot of Indian legend about Spirit Lake, and supposedly her and her father lived there, and this sinister man was annoying her, and she also had an Indian lover, and the sinister man was trying to get her away from him, and her father was taking her from Spirit Lake to Buffalo Creek, I believe, or the Cattaraugus Reservation, and it was on their way that the sinister man followed them and murdered her father. And this Dolph family took her in, and then her Indian lover appeared on the scene, and the sinister man appeared again, and they got in a fight, and the man was killed, and so was her Indian lover, and Mr. Dolph buried them both beside the father along the creek, and then she was so heartbroken. She stayed with the Dolph family, but she was so heartbroken that eventually she went out and laid across the grave of her lone wolf, and died there and was buried next to him.
you live in Indian Falls, right?
Correct.
So does my grandmother. So you said Spirit Lake, about Spirit Lake. Whereabouts is that located?
It's located about a half a mile, I would say, north of Indian Falls. It's back in the woods, and it's kind of secluded. If you didn't know it was there, you wouldn't know where it was.
Is it by the Methodist church? Like where that little park used to be, that little railroad train that used to run
it's
over?
about a half a mile north of there, down as you head towards Batham.
Okay.
Actually, it's across from Larry Klutzbach's and where he lives. But the owners that own it today don't like to broadcast the exact spot because of the insurance liabilities of people going there today.
So to conclude this interview, is there anything else you would like to add to Murder Creek? And
oh, I can't think of anything. Exactly. I guess that's that's it. If anybody wants to know more, they can read Dr. Arthur Parker's version or our brochure.
thank you very much for coming. I really enjoyed you being here and meeting you. Thank you very much for coming. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I hope you had fun.
I did.
Renee, my grandmother.
Yes, I do. She lived next door to me when I was growing up.
Really?
Yes.
Wow.
She was Dolores Persky then.
Yeah. We're trying to find out our family tree about them.
I used to play with her all the time.
Oh, wow. I'll have to ask her. She knows you. It's amazing.
Well, I can tell you that one day she got mad at me on the way home from school and she hit me over the head with her lunch bucket. I don't know if she remembers that or not, but I do. And, oh yeah, we went to school together. We went to district school number 2. She was, I believe she was a year or 2 ahead of me in school.
Wow.
And, yep, we walked home from school together every day. I can tell you a little story about my father and coming to Akron. He was born in 1899, and when he was about 6 years old, why, he had never been out of Indian Falls.
Really?
Well, transportation back then was horse and buggy. Everything was done in your hometown. Well, his uncle was a bachelor, and so one day he told him that he would bring him to Akron, and my dad was so excited, him and his brother was 4. So he put him in the back of the wagon, like a buckboard, and they drove over to Akron. Well, my uncle got his groceries, and my dad said he was so excited. His eyes were as big as saucers because he had never seen a big city like Akron.
Wow.
Before. And with all the horses and buggies coming and going, and the streets were full of people going into the stores. And so my uncle got his groceries, and he put them in the back of the wagon and put my uncle and his father in there, and he says, now you boys stay here. I'm going in here for a little while, and he headed for the closest tavern. Well, he was in there quite a while because my uncle fell asleep. And my dad says, oh, he just sat there with his eyes so big watching everything. He was so excited. When pretty soon my uncle came kind of staggering out of the tavern and got up on the wagon, got the reins loose, hit the horses with them and said, giddy up, tied the reins up, crawled in the back and laid down and went to sleep with my uncle. And my dad was so scared because he thought, I've never been here before. I don't know the way home. How am I going to get home? But he says the horses kept going, and he says, I still didn't see anything familiar. And he says, finally we got to the Tonawanda Creek. And the horses went down and they walked across the creek. And my uncle lived on the other side of the creek, and they went right up and right into the barn. He says, I didn't know the way home, but the horses did. And that was his experience coming to Akron.
Wow.
This doesn't have anything to do with Akron, but we forget how times were back then. My dad's family was a very poor family. He had never seen an orange. He was about 5 years old, and he had never seen an orange. Him or his brother. And one Christmas, the same bachelor uncle had come to Akron, and he had brought back 2 oranges, one for each one of them. And my grandmother, they were in school, so my grandmother took them and put them up, and the next morning was Christmas morning, and she put an orange in each one of their stockings. Well, my father said he got up and he was just so excited they were because they had never had an orange before. And he says, we took it out and we handled it and we looked at it, and he said, we wanted to eat it, but we wanted to keep it too. He says, we didn't want it over with. But he says, finally temptation won out, and he says, we ate that, and he says, it was the most delicious thing I ever ate in my life. And that's all they got in their Christmas stockings. We forget today.
It's oranges.
We get so many things that what it was really like. And of course, you know, back when I was growing up, my mother died when I was 2, so I came back. I was born in Buffalo. I came back to Indian Falls to live with my grandparents, and I was raised there. Well, back then, my grandparents had electric lights, but they did not have an inside bathroom. An outhouse. Well, everybody in town did. I don't believe there was one bathroom in town. Finally, in the late 30s, Earl Phelps, they remodeled their house and they put a bathroom in. And they were the first ones, the only ones in town that had a bathroom. And then when the missionaries would come to visit the church, they always had to stay with Earl Phelps because they were the only ones that had inside plumbing. But anyway, we had an outhouse, and of course my grandparents were older, and when I was a kid growing up, I you know, we used to hear stories too about how they used to have corn cobs instead of toilet tissue, and they would put fur around their toilet seats in the winter to keep their selves warm while they were sitting out there. And so I had heard those jokes, but I thought they were just jokes. But when I was about in 8th grade, I come home from school one day, and our outhouse, in order to keep it warm, it was hooked to the back of our barn. So you had to go through the barn into the outhouse. Well, there were no lights in the barn, so it was kind of dark back in there. Well, I came off the school bus, and I'm running up to go into the outhouse, and as I opened the door, I thought there was an animal in the seat. Well, I made a lot of noise, slammed things around, and it didn't move, so I finally got a big long stick out of the barn, and I poked it in there, and it didn't move, and so I kind of stood aside to let the light in a little bit, and I saw my grandfather in his old age had taken an old fur coat that we had, and he had made strips and tacked it around the toilet seat. So we had a fur-lined toilet. Well, of course, you know, teenagers can have a tend to get kind of smart-mouthed, and I was no different. And I went running in the house, and I said, "What have you got on that seat? Because it's fur, and I am not sitting on that fur." And he said, "Well, that's what we did when I was growing up." He was born in a log cabin in 1867, and he says, "That's what we did. We put fur around it." And he said, "If you want to freeze your rear end this winter, you go right ahead. I'm not going to." Luckily, we had a 2-holer. And then there was also the jokes about the corn cobs. I don't, you're probably too young to have heard those, but back in the early days, instead of toilet tissue, they used corn cobs. And a little while later, I came home from school, and it was my job to keep the outhouse clean. And so I went out, and here's this wooden box with corn cobs in it, in the outhouse. So I thought, what are they doing in here? So I took them out. When I went back the next time, there was the box back in there again. I did that about 3 times, and all of a sudden a light bulb went on in my head, and I thought, I know my grandfather's getting old, but we have toilet paper. He wouldn't. Well, I kind of looked, and he was. And so I finally thought, oh, well, if that's what he wants at his age, he's 86, let him go ahead. So I left him in there. So when anybody tells any stories about corn cobs and fur-lined outhouses, I lived it.
Okay. That's really funny.
Oh, that was excellent.
I don't know. I want to go hide.
If you want it edited, fine, but I'll tell you, it's precious. Do you guys agree? Yes. I think it's just precious.
Are we still recording?
I really had an advantage being raised by my grandparents, because it's like I'm a generation back further. Because I can remember things that my cousins don't remember, because I listened to my grandparents, and I always loved listening to their stories and everything. And once when I was about 10 years old, I was out on a summer's night out in the lawn swing with my grandpa, and it was a big moon out, and he said to me, you know, I've seen a lot of things in my lifetime. I was born in a log cabin, and he said there were only horse and buggies, and I saw automobiles, I saw trains, and I saw automobiles, and he says now we're seeing airplanes. And even when I was 10 years old, it was a big thing when an airplane went over, because everybody ran outside to look up. And so he said to me, you know, that moon up there, he says, someday men are going to go to that moon. He said, I'm not going to live to see it, but you are. And I thought at the time, he's got to be crazy. Why would anybody want to go up there? And but now that I'm older, I can see how farsighted he was. Now, he never went beyond 3rd grade in school, but he read a lot. He would read the newspaper every day. And I thought how great it would be if he could have lived, because our oldest son was in the Navy, served in the Navy, and he was on the recovery unit when Apollo 10 and Apollo 11 went to the moon. And I thought, you know, how great that would be if my grandfather could have known that his great-grandson was on the recovery site when he was on a communications relay ship, and he was there when he saw them both come down. So.
I'm going to cry. That is just beautiful. Oh my God. I'm sure your grandfather knows. I'm sure. That's beautiful. I'm so glad you turned that on. Thank you. Yeah. Jim hit the record button when he saw you were going to tell another story.
Oh,
Story.
I didn't know that was it.
You're so
We're like
good, Jim.
so
Thank you.
recording.
Being recorded.
It's phenomenal to hear your stories. I mean, if you think of any more, please keep talking. These are precious. They're just wonderful stories, because we don't, to tell you the truth, as old as I am, I never realized it wasn't until the 30s that people had indoor plumbing.
Well, in the
That's
country.
only 20 years before I was born.
Yeah, in the country they didn't. I think, in Akron, a lot of them, most of them probably did have bathrooms. But when you lived out in the country, you didn't. And, well, talking about airplanes, it's the same as in World War II. World War II, we were still running outside looking up when we heard an airplane go over. And the big thing in our town is Marshall Tyler, who was one of our neighbors. I bet if you asked your grandmother, she'll remember this. He was a navigator on an airplane, and they were going overseas during World War II, and he wrote to his mother and said that he was going to navigate him over Indian Falls and circle his house on his way overseas. And so, of course, the word spread through town like crazy that he was going to come, and on what day, and around noon. Well, at noon that day, everybody for miles around was outside, and I can see him yet. We were all standing out in the yard, and as that plane circled over, I think it went about 4 times, and he was standing in the doorway of the plane, and we were all waving to him. You know, he was like almost at treetop level. So it's...
I have another question for you. What were planes like back in, like,
Well, I don't believe I really got to see one up close.
I mean, like, what
I
it
saw
looked like?
small ones, like, you know, on... They were pretty primitive, pretty small. Like some of them you might see on the movies today. I mean, you didn't, to my knowledge, nobody ever flew anywhere. Nobody I knew ever went on an airplane flight from here to there. Even during World War II, the soldiers went on trains. They weren't flown from base to base. Or my husband was in the service, and he went across country on a plane or on a train, and he told about how they had old wood cook stoves on the train that they cooked their meals for the ones in the service. You should interview Terry's father. He's the one that's got good stories.
What did you say the name, Marshall?
Marshall Tyler. He graduated from Akron School, by the way.
Really?
A lot of the young people from Indian Falls graduated from Akron School. Oh, you wanted me to tell you about my experience coming to Akron School. Well, I went to live with my aunt in Mogadore when I was in 5th grade, I believe, 5th or 6th grade, I don't remember exactly. Anyway, I could either go to East Pembroke School or Akron School, because both buses went by. At that time, schools weren't centralized, so you could go to whichever school you wanted to after you got out of grade school. Well, they decided to send me to Akron School because they thought it was more progressive, and I got over to Akron School here, and I was kind of coming from a district school with only 2 kids in my class, myself and another boy, and coming to a school where there was a lot of kids. I think there was 30 or 40 kids in a room, and I had Mrs. Axtell for a teacher. Well, she was, I imagine, a very good teacher. She was very nice to me, but she scared me to death because she could holler, and she would go after those boys and yank them out of their seats and really go after them. Well, I happened to be sat between 2, I guess, of the bad boys in the class, because every once in a while she would start back after one of those, and I thought she was after me, and I was so scared that I got sick to my stomach, and I couldn't go to school because I was sick. And so finally my father took me to Dr. Stanberry, and so Dr. Stanberry, they couldn't find anything wrong with me, and so Dr. Stanberry told my dad to go out in the waiting room, and he started talking to me, and he asked me why I didn't want to go to school, and I told him what was happening and that I was afraid. I was afraid of the teacher, so he went out and told my dad that he thought he better send me to a smaller school. I was afraid. So that was my whole experience. I think I was enrolled for 2 weeks and probably went 4 days.
4 days.
That's fantastic. I'd forgotten that one. And we were going to make sure that you mentioned that. So good thing you brought that one up. That was your whole...
I was with my uncle, and down at the foot of Main Street, when you're going up Buell, is it? The bridge there? Well, it was a plank bridge, bottom bridge then, and there was most people had cars, but there were still people that had horse and buggies then too. And this guy with a horse and buggy started across that bridge, and of course it clink, clink, you know, when the wagon went across it, and it scared the horse. And he sat down in the middle of the bridge, and they couldn't get him to go. Nobody could get across the bridge. They finally yanked on him and yanked on him and yanked on him, and finally got him across the bridge.
I love it. That's a good one too.
We came to Akron once too. I came with my uncle, and we started up Fuel Street, and his car caught on fire. And we pulled into a house, and the lady came out with a pail of water, and she says, "I've called the fire department." And my uncle took the pail of water and poured it on the fire. And then he jumped in the car and he says, "We're going." And we said, "Well, the fire department's on its way." He says, "I don't want to be here when they come. They'll charge me for coming." We took off and went home.
Oh, that is cute.
Was in 8th grade, I believe, when World War II started. And I was at with my grandparents and my father at my uncle's on that Sunday. We'd gone to church, and then we went there for dinner. And all the kids, me included, was running through the house and tearing through the house when all of a sudden I realized that nobody was yelling at us. And I stopped. They were all huddled around the radio. And I stopped for a minute to see what they were talking about, and I heard them, like bombing the Sandwich Islands, and they were all excited. The grown-ups were all, had their heads in the radio and were so worried and everything. And I thought, the Sandwich Islands, oh, that's got to be a long ways away. What are they getting so excited about? But then I realized that it was a big thing, and that's what really, it opened the world to me. I mean, before that, you lived in your own little community and you were concerned with it. Yeah, you studied geography, but that was way far away. And World War II really opened up the world, because all of a sudden, the kids you went to school with, the kids that were next door to you, they were going to all these places that you'd only heard of. And, then just before that, schools had been centralized. And the buses came around to pick you up. You didn't go to the district schools anymore. The buses picked you up. That started when I was in 7th grade. And we had air raid, drills, where we'd have to go to a designated spot in the hall and get down on our hands and knees and put our heads, under our arms. And there was rationing. I mean, we collected milkweed pods for the life jackets, in there. The kids, you'd gather it by the bag full. And we went around and raided everybody's barns and stuff for all their old license plates, old iron, and every small town had a big scrap pile where you took everything possible for the war. If you had any extra pennies, you bought saving stamps till you got enough to get a war bond. World War II really opened up everything to people my generation. It's and then pretty soon the kids in your own class were quitting school or joining up or being drafted. And when we were in high school, we would go out. They were so short of farm help that we would go out. The buses would take, school buses, they take you out of school, and you'd go pick tomatoes or pick up potatoes. World War II really opened up. And when I graduated in 1945, the war with Japan wasn't over yet. It was not till August, I believe. War bonds were, I think that you paid $18.75, and in 10 years they were worth $25. And for $37.50, in 10 years they were worth $50.
Wow.
I don't remember about the $100 ones. I never had that much money. But when you were a kid in school, a big thing was they would sell stamps. like 10-cent stamps or quarter stamps. And I mean, you really felt you were doing something for the war effort if you had 10 cents and you bought a war stamp, and then you had a book and you pasted them in. And then when you got $18.75 worth, then you could get a war bond. First they were called defense bonds, and then they were called war bonds. And it was nothing. I mean, after school was centralized, and I went to Corfu to school, which was 4 miles away from Indian Falls. I mean, we'd walk to school. We'd walk the 4 miles if there was something going on at night or something, some program, and walk back. Before the war started, when the schools were first centralized, when they had basketball games at night, they used to have basketball games between the schools at night, like at 7 o'clock, they would send the school buses out around and pick up anybody that wanted to go. If you had the nickel or the dime to buy the ticket to go to the game, you could go on the bus. But as soon as World War II came, and then there was gas shortage. And during World War II, there was a ban for a while on pleasure driving. And if we could find somebody to bring us to Akron to the show, I mean, we'd park down some side street and walk to the show, because you could get arrested for driving for pleasure. If we happened to get somebody that was fortunate enough to take us to Batavia to the show, I mean, then we really would park quite a ways away and walk, because they were really strict about enforcing it there.
Now that I didn't know. I never heard about that. That's incredible.
For extra money, when he was going to school, he would, for $5, he would clean one of those outhouses. And I don't mean the inside of it, I mean the underneath. Yeah, he'd get $5 for an outhouse.
What was Batavia like?
Batavia was pretty small and pretty quiet. And it was a big deal to go, really big deal to go to Batavia. It was for me, because we didn't have a car. But it was great at Christmas. It was great to go to Batavia at Christmas, because there were so many stores and so many neat things. They're just, boy, for $1, you could buy 10 Christmas presents for $1. 10 cents a piece, the stuff you could get. It was, and I can, they talk about kids in car seats now. I can remember when I was young, we went to Batavia once, and the family that we went with only had a coupe, which was just a front seat. There was no back seat. And so they put all us kids in the trunk and shut the trunk and took us to Batavia. I mean, try to do that today.
Didn't get very far.
You'd be arrested for child abuse. I gotta quit.
Okay. Oh, this was wonderful. These stories are just precious. They're incredible.
Archie Salvi happened to be the first, and his wife happened to be the first ones in Indian Falls that got a television set. Well, of course, everybody was curious, because nobody had seen one, and so and of course it didn't come on until 6 o'clock at night. Well, at 6 o'clock at night, I mean, she had to hurry up, have her supper over at 5 o'clock and her dishes done, because at 6 o'clock at night, everybody in town swarmed into her house. She had a small house too. But everybody in town swarmed in. Well, they seemed to think back then that you couldn't have any lights on. You had to watch it like you did at the movies. So the house would be totally dark, and I'm not kidding. There would be people on the floor, people on the couch, people behind the couch, people in the dining room, people peeking around the corners. And it was like that night after night after night. And she would make popcorn like it was going out of style. And I thought afterwards, you know, they must have got awful sick of everybody in town every night in their house. Well, then finally, gradually, the different ones began to get TVs and they got their house back again.
Holy mackerel, that's incredible. Yeah, but picture that. Picture you turn on your TV anytime before 6 and there's nothing.
I know. That's what I'm saying.
I've forgotten
You can find
that,
stuff
too.
in the middle of the night to watch.
I actually remember that it used to just not come on till nighttime?
Shows on TV.
Well, I remember cowboy movies because I can remember my grandfather watching those and thinking they were great. After a while, I know my grandmother, who was 86, got it, watched wrestling after a while when that was on. And there's this old lady sitting on the edge of her seat hollering, "Get him, get him, get him, get him!" But it was what was it? I remember Mama or something was on. I don't quite remember.
Mama's Family.
Something it was on, but I remember the cowboy movies because my grandfather was all excited about those. And
Newsreels?
probably that I don't remember too much because at that time I wasn't interested in the news. But that was